When you create an Excel VBA subroutine, you expect it to take data from a cell or an array, transform it in some way, and change the workbook or display the result. Sometimes, however, you will want your VBA code to run until a condition is met. When you want a segment of your code to repeat until it encounters a specific condition, you can use the do loop construction. The do loop construction is particularly useful for finding the first empty cell in a column. As an example, suppose you have a suggestion box form where store visitors can enter their email address, name, and suggestions. You want the VBA code to take their input and write it in the first empty row in another worksheet. For example, let's say that I were writing the input from the form to here on sheet 3. Now, before I show you the example code, I want to tell you how to stop your code from running it in case you create a loop that won't stop on its own. It's easier than you think to write a loop that will run on to infinity. If you find you've done that, press Ctrl-C or the escape key to abort the procedure and to let you edit your code. Now, let's take a look at the code that we'll be using. To create a do loop, write whatever code you need to set the initial conditions for the routine to run properly, type do, and press enter a couple of times, and type loop. So what I've done here is I've created a routine that will activate or display sheet 3, and then it goes to cell A2 and activates it. So if we go back Alt F11 and look at sheet 3, cell A1 has the name header, so I have Excel start in cell A2, which is the first cell that could potentially be blank. It's not blank right now, but it could be if there were no names in the list. So now that you know where the data will go, let's switch back Alt F11 to the code module. When Excel starts running the do loop, the first thing it does is check to see if the active cell is blank. In other words, if its value is nothing. If that's true, then Excel has found the first empty cell, which is the goal, and then it can execute the code to the right of the then statement, which is exit do. In other words, it will exit the do loop. It is vital that you put an exit do statement within a do loop so that Excel is able to exit the loop rather than keep going on to infinity, even though the condition is met. Now let's say that the cell isn't blank, that it contains a value. If that's true, then Excel activates the cell 1 row and 0 columns below the active cell. In other words, it moves the active cell down a row and checks it again because the loop statement tells it to go back and check. That can be a little hard to visualize, so let's go through the code one step at a time. I have the Visual Basic Editor and the workbook set up side by side so you can see what happens as I step through the code. I'll give you more information about debugging your code later. For now, all you need to know is that you can move through a subroutine one step at a time by pressing F8. So I'll do that now. And Excel highlights the step that will be run next. So we're just at the start, press F8 again. Now it activates sheet 3 and it activates cell A2. This time through the loop, the code checks to see if the active cell is blank. It's not, so it skips down to the next line. Again, the code activates the cell 1 row below the active cell, and we go back into the loop again because we weren't told to exit. This time, when Excel checks to see whether the active cell is blank, it is. So pressing F8 indicates that it will exit the do loop. In other words, the if statement's condition was met. That means that we followed the directions after then, which is to exit the do loop, and we end up on the last line of the subroutine, which is end sub, and we're done. And as you can see, the do loop has found the first empty cell in column A on sheet 3, where you can write a new record with a customer's suggestion. The do loop I just showed you might never run the active cell.offset code to move down a row in the worksheet because it tests to see if a condition is met. If it's not met, the code will never run. If you want to ensure the code in a routine runs at least once, you can create either a do while loop or a do until loop. These variations put the test on the loop line, which is at the bottom of the code block, so you don't have to test for a condition in the middle of the loop. As an example, here's an equivalent routine that I created using a do until loop. Again, it activates sheet 3, but this time, instead of activating cell A2, it activates cell A1. And the reason that's the case is because the do loop will run at least once. We know that there is a value in cell A1. There might not be a value in cell A2, so that means that we want to activate the cell 1 row below the active cell at least once, moving it to A2. So how long do we continue to run through the loop? We do so until the active cell value is blank. Once that value is blank, Excel steps out of the loop and in this case ends the subroutine. Finally, you can construct the same loop using a do while statement. Again, activate sheet 3, cell A1 because the code is going to run at least once. In this case, what you're testing for is whether the active cell value is not blank. Because if it is not blank, then you go back and repeat this action again, activating the cell 1 row below the active cell. It's going to happen at least once because you don't test for anything before you execute the instruction, but if the active sub value is not blank, then it will loop again and repeat the activity. The do loop and its variations let your code repeat a series of actions until a condition is met. Be very careful though. If you define a condition that can't be met, your code might run indefinitely. Pressing Ctrl-C or the escape key might be the only way to stop your code from running on forever.